Welcome back. Now we've created an ability, and we've seen that we can activate abilities as soon as we grant them, which is great, but we'd like to be able to activate abilities via input. So let's discuss about possible ways to do it. Now, binding input directly to the ability system component was something that we could do before enhanced input. Before enhanced input came around, there was the option to bind input directly to abilities. So you press a button and an ability receives that input automatically and either activates or does whatever it wants to do depending on how you've coded that ability. Now, this was done by creating an enum with ability input constants. So it was a rigid system, as you would sort of hard code these enum constants into an ability input enum, and those inputs would be linked to those specific abilities. Now, this was something that we could do before the old input system became deprecated, but now we have enhanced input, and things are done a little bit differently, and the changes are for the better, in my opinion. Input actions are bound to inputs via the input mapping context. This is just how enhanced input works. Now, we can decide how to activate abilities in response to these inputs, and we can do this any way we'd like. Lyra, the multiplayer shooter example project provided by Epic Games, provides us with one example of linking up enhanced input with the gameplay ability system abilities of that project, and it's a little bit over-engineered. Lyra is a great example of how to do things, but it can be overly complicated and hard to approach. Now, what we'll do in this course is similar to how Lyra does it, but a little bit less complicated as we don't need the over flexibility that Lyra provides us with. So our approach will be a little bit less complicated, but that doesn't mean it will be less useful or flexible. We're going to take a data-driven approach. I'd like to be able to change the input to ability mappings at runtime. In other words, pressing the left mouse button to activate a specific ability should be something that we should be able to change at runtime. And thanks to the gameplay ability system's flexibility, this is actually not very hard to do, provided that we code this well. Now, what we're going to do is create a data asset that's going to contain input actions, but we're going to link up input actions with gameplay tags. I'd like to have a gameplay tag for each of our inputs. For example, the one key, the left mouse button, the right mouse button, and so on. And at runtime, we should be able to assign various tags to our gameplay abilities. And then as we activate abilities, every ability will be associated with its input tag, which can be checked and changed. So the first step is to make this data asset. So let's do it. I'm going to launch the editor, and we'll make a new C++ class for our data asset. So I'm going to go to C++ classes, Aura, public, and we're going to put this new data asset into a new folder called input. Let's go ahead and create a new C++ class and choose all classes, and this will be a data asset. So selecting data asset, we're going to put this in public/input. Now, this is going to be an input configuration. So I'm going to call this Aura input config. So I'll go ahead and create the class and close the editor. Now I'm going to go ahead and close all tabs and open my new input config. So starting with the public folder, I'm going to open input. Here's Aura input config, and Alt-O will open the CPP file. Now, the input config is not going to be terribly complicated. I just want an array of input actions, but our input actions need to be linked to gameplay tags. So I want an easy way to link up an input action with a gameplay tag. And the way that Lyra does it is pretty nice, and that's the approach that I'm going to take for our project. What we're going to do is create a struct. And the struct will be simple. It will contain an input action and a gameplay tag. So we'll make this struct here. We'll call this f_aura input action. And we'll give it a ustruct with the blueprint type, and of course a generated body. And f_aura input action is going to contain an input action. Now I'm going to make this a const input action, and I'm also going to forward declare the class uInput action, so we don't have to include that header file. And this input action pointer will be called input action, and it will be initialized to null pointer. Now it's const, meaning it can't be changed at runtime, but that doesn't mean we can't set it to a value. We're going to set it in the blueprint for this data asset by giving it a U property and making it either edit anywhere or edit defaults only. I think edit defaults only makes more sense. And in addition to this, we'll make an fGameplay tag called input tag. And this should also be a const gameplay tag. We'll initialize it with fGameplay tag, just an empty tag. Now, this is not a pointer or a reference, so we are going to include the header file for our gameplay tag. That's gameplay tag container.h. And this can be also edit defaults only. And now that we have this struct, our data asset can contain an array of these that we can set in the data asset blueprint. Now we're going to add public. Didn't need to do that for the struct because struct bodies are public automatically, right? So let's add this T array. It's going to be of type f_aura input action. So we'll have an array of these structs, and we're going to call this ability input actions. Now this we're going to fill in the blueprint. So we're going to give it a U property with edit defaults only. I'd like to make it blueprint read only just in case we need to access it. And now we have a data asset that contains an array of input actions, specifically Aura input actions, which have a gameplay tag. Now this is great because if we have a pointer or a reference to this input config, then we can look up in this array any of our input actions that have a specific tag. And I'd like to make a function for performing this lookup. So we're going to make a function that returns a const uInput action. So why do we want to return an input action and not an Aura input action? Well, we could return an Aura input action, but this is going to be more useful if we can return just the input action associated with a gameplay tag. And then this f_aura input action is kind of an internal thing to our input config. We don't have to worry about breaking it open and finding the input action inside. This function is just going to do all that for us. So this function will be called find ability input action for tag, which will take a const fGameplay tag by reference called input tag, and I'll have an optional boolean be log not found. We'll set it to false by default, and this will be a const function. So this will simply return the input action associated with a given tag. So let's generate the definition. Now, if you'd like a little challenge, why don't you implement this on your own? Go ahead and pause the video and figure out how to find the input action associated with a given tag from our ability input actions array. So if you're up for the challenge, go ahead and pause the video now and give it a try. Okay, so I want to find the input action associated with the input tag passed into this function. So I'm simply going to loop through our input actions in ability input actions. So this will be a range-based for loop. Looping through each f_aura input action, I'm going to use const reference. We'll call this action, and it's each action in ability input actions. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to check to see if its tag matches. So we'll say if, and I'll say action.inputAction. And this input action could be a null pointer, so we'll check to see if it's null. And we'll also check its input tag. So we'll say action.inputTag. We'll see if it's equal to input tag. And if we succeed and get inside this if statement, we'll return this input action. So we'll say return action.inputAction. And that's it. Now we have this bool for if we can't find anything, right? If we don't find our input action, or perhaps we fail to get inside this if statement and get to this return, that means the input action was a null pointer. Any of those things happen, then we have a problem. So we'll say if b log not found, then we'll do a UE log. We'll log out an error. So for now, we're using log temp until we create our own log category, and we're going to say error text, and we can just say can't find ability input action for input tag, and we'll say the tag. We'll use a %s for the string for tag on input config, and we'll say what this class is. So first we have our input tag. We're going to use star input tag dot to string. And then for the input config, we're going to use the name, and we can use the function get name safe, passing in this. And this returns an F string. We'll have to use the star on this as well. So we'll log an error if b log not found. And by the end of this, we'll have to return a null pointer, as we have to return a pointer from this, right? So now we have a function to find an input action associated with a given tag, and this only works if we link up tags to input actions by filling out this data asset. Now we also need input tags, right? We're going to need a bunch of gameplay tags for any of the inputs that we want in our game. So we can add those natively to Aura gameplay tags. So I'd like to do that. We have our primary and secondary attributes. I'll put these underneath it. Looks like we have this empty protected section. Since it's not being used, I'll go ahead and remove that, and we'll make an F gameplay tag for each of our inputs. So I'm going to call these input tag as the first tag in the hierarchy. We'll say input tag dot, and I'll have an LMB for left mouse button. I'd like one for the right mouse button. I'll call that RMB. And then we'll have one for the number keys. And really, it's not very important which keys we end up mapping to these. I'm just going to give these tags the names input tag dot 1, 2, 3, and 4. And I can go into Aura gameplay tags.cpp and add those right here in our initialize native gameplay tags function. So after secondary attributes, I'm going to actually copy this function call to add native gameplay tag. I'm going to copy the comment as well and go all the way down to the bottom. And this is going to be input tags. So we have gameplay tags dot and the name of the tag. This is going to start off with input tag LMB, and we're going to add a native gameplay tag, and it's going to be input tag dot LMB. And for the F string, we can just say input tag for left mouse button. And we can just follow this pattern and make the rest of them. So we're going to have the right mouse button as well as, and it looks like I missed the semicolon there, as well as keys 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we just need to change these. This one will be input tag RMB. We'll change the F name as well. And this will say right mouse button. Next we'll have input tag 1. the string will say input tag dot one. This is error prone, so we have to make sure not to put any typos in. And this will say input tag for, instead of left mouse button, we'll say one key. Next, we have input tag 2, changing the F name, and it's input tag for 2 key. And then we have 3. We'll go ahead and change that one. And finally, input tag 4. And there we go. So now that we've added some native tags for our inputs, then our input tag makes more sense here in our data asset, and we can make some input actions and add them to our data asset. So what we can do is, let's go ahead and compile and launch, make sure we don't have any errors. And it looks like I have an error here, Aura input config, const properties are not supported. We're going to have to remove the const from the gameplay tag. Compiling again, and that's going to fix that problem. So we can have a const pointer. We can't have a const gameplay tag. Let's launch the engine now. And we just need to create our new data asset. Before we do, let's go to project settings and just make sure that everything looks okay in our gameplay tags. We have our input tag category with 1 through 4, LMB and RMB, and that looks great. So we'll make our data asset. Let's go to Blueprints, and we have an input category already where we have our input mapping context and our input actions. Let's go ahead and make our data asset. We'll go to Miscellaneous, Data Asset, and choose Aura Input Config. Select that, call this DA Aura Input Config. We'll go ahead and open this up, and we can add some ability input actions, but we need input actions for all of our inputs, and that's going to be relatively straightforward. Now, move is a 2-dimensional input, but for our ability inputs, we're going to be 1-dimensional. So we'll right-click, we'll go to Input, choose Input Action. We'll call these IA underscore and just keep it simple. This one will be LMB. We'll open this up. It's going to be axis 1D float, and that's it. And we'll make all of the rest of them. So we'll make another one. Input action. We'll call this IA RMB. Change it to axis 1D float. We'll make another one. IA underscore 1. Again, value type axis 1D float. And we just need 2 through 3, so I can quickly time lapse the rest of them. Okay, so we've got them all. I'm going to save all and go ahead and close out of these input actions. Just middle mouse clicking on the tab there. And now we need to make sure that our input mapping context has them mapped to inputs. So we have our IA move. Let's go ahead and add the rest of the input actions. So here's the next one. And I'll start with IA1 and click the keyboard and hit the 1 key. And that's it. This is going to be simple. I'm not going to add any triggers or modifiers. We're just going to map the IA1 to the 1 key. Let's add another one. This will be IA2. I'll click the keyboard and hit 2. We'll add another mapping. This will be IA3 mapped to 3. And another one. This will be IA4 mapped to 4. And then 2 more for the mouse buttons. I'm going to click plus. This will be IA LMB, and I'm going to click and click. That'll give me the left mouse button. And finally, our IA RMB right there. I'm going to left click and right click, and that'll give me the right mouse button. And now they're all linked up to the inputs that I want them to have. But of course, we can always switch out input mapping context if we want those to be changed. But now that I have my input mapping context set up, we know that each input action is linked to those keys as long as we're using that input mapping context, which we are. Then we can add these to our input config by clicking plus and expanding it. And ability input actions is an array of Aura input actions. Those are just a struct with an input action and an input tag. And this data asset is what we will use to link up those input actions with their tags. So I'm going to choose IA1, and for the tag, I'm going to expand input tag and choose 1. And now IA1 is associated with this tag. And if we call the function we created to look up an input action based on a tag, then we'll get the correct input action. So that's IA1. Let's add another one. We'll choose IA2. For the input tag, we'll choose input tag 2. And we'll repeat this process for the rest of them. Okay, so now we have our input config filled out. Now this is cool because we can always swap out our data assets, even dynamically at runtime if we want to swap those out. We can swap out for other inputs. We can swap out for other configurations that have different tags, whatever we want really. But now we have 6 different input tags associated with different input actions. And this is what we'll be using to link up our inputs to not only ability activation, but whatever else we want to link up our inputs to. And that's the first step in our system. So excellent job. Make sure to save all, and I'll see you in the next video.